Okay, I'm just my screen with a weird map. Um, I hope. So, everyone, today's talk will be about a chapter I have in this book that was just published a couple of months ago. Downloads figure is way old; it's 25,000 now. But I just stole this picture from another author, posted it. I haven't got my physical copy yet, and my chapter has the title of this talk, so I'm basically covering exactly that. And there was a call for the whole chapter. If you and I will, I'm not very fond of slides, so and those who know me know that I always use these huge mind maps, and they're because they're same as my own notes, and I can adjust a little bit. I shouldn't follow every little bunch because we have limited time. There's a lot in it, and if you have, maybe I find that another that is interesting. So basically, I will talk about various aspects of using AI. This is basically the abstract, expanded as a mind map, sort of a pragmatic view of what can be done with AI, what is missing, and how it other technologies in context of art, and also be a bit critical about how we talk about how we describe agency, AI, art. As was mentioned earlier, no computers can like Van Gogh. They can produce images that look like that, but it's much more complex than that. And what is the role of humans in current AI systems? So let's be a little bit speculative and visionary about, the future when the AIs will make art their own, and will they actually about us? So a few words, some of me, but there were a lot of cases. So I'm actually originally a musician, a trained classical composer, improviser with 10 years of full-time music studies. And I still perform and compose music. I'm also active in many other kinds of art. But I'm a researcher, interaction design here at Computer Science and Engineering at UNN Chalmers. I develop sort of synthesis of the future or new interaction technologies for ensembles. So I a lot with evolutionary computation. It was the topic of my PhD in 2004, applied to artistic creativity. And that has also led to philosophizing about creativity, which is exactly now. I have a lot of various affiliations. So basically, Department of Computer Science and Engineering. So the main teacher in electronic music composition at Music and Drama in Gothenburg, and so adjunct professor in Denmark at Aalborg University. So and the what were you first question I got by the when I arrived in the Zoom, actually a musician and a programming hacker. Basically followed from then, explored computer art through computer graphics, started composing, improvising, creative process from like the age of 12 or something, and then started to try to emulate it already at that time, and basically just continued to do what I like and what I'm interested in. And I should say that I'm still both musician and composer. A musician, I have a lot of embodied agency when I make music. I'm very interested in embodied aspects of both computation and music making. But as a composer, the sort of the intellectual aspects of things, cognitive aspects of things. And as an AI producer of AI systems that compose music by themselves, can I be a composer of composers? Is that possible? And that's what we're trying to be. So all here, and I don't get into bring all this, but of big questions. This book chapter I'm talking about is quite long and should probably be its own book, and tries to cover the whole aspects of AI in arts in it, which is of course, but you want to cram in a lot of things. AI ever be independent, creative, and what are dangerous, desirable, etc. Doesn't matter who actually art, and we will talk about this. Algorithmic art meaningful Well, actually, there's a lot of it, but what sort of aesthetic implications does it come with? And is it even not coming from a being of the same kind of myself? Is an interesting so to ask yourself. We'll jump a little bit. I will assume, because I did a around creative process, artistic creative process, which has published in other publications earlier. So just to share of creative process as kind of a space of possibilities, where material that you're working with, and the process is affected the pathways in the medium defined by the starting with. Tools can be theoretical tools or very hands-on tools like a pencil, but it can also be, Photoshop or a theory or thing like that. And that also involves a predictive view, sort of internal tools, which is limited, which means that you also this is where you did not intend, which is also a source of novelty processes. And also we have a sort of different representations of the work during this process inside the head, and there's a kind of iterated representations. This is like a 40 pages into 30 seconds, but just so you know, sort of that view. I don't think I need to say what is AI audience, because I mean a lot of things and aspects in there, but I just show the headings there and go on from there. But one important thing to notice, and I will come back to that, is the role of AI algorithms in a lot of contexts, especially in engineering and organization. This is the common use, and to find solution or the right solution, etc. But in art, we're more interested in exploration because we actually know what the goal is. We want the unknown, and that is one of the big problems in creativity by art. What we can do with AI in art, maybe we should also ask what does an artist do, and what is it that characterizes an artist. So art from process, that is duration, it's not instantaneous, it interacts with its surroundings. Artist, there's a information between the artist and this outside. The artist has hopefully some or unconscious. If it's unconscious, there may be lots of values that sort of shine through. Also, the input is usually relatable in some way, by the receiver, so to speak, the viewer, or conceptually relate to the world that we live in, to art, etc. This is a discussion, or empathetically relate the efforts involved in making or for example, when I listen to ensemble improvising, empathetically relate to the efforts when and the situation they are in. So a human AI artist would sort of have these kind of properties probably to produce meaningful results, not outputs from human artists, which is very fundamentally uncreative. Communicate new stuff derived from its own life interactions, and maybe we don't yet have the concept of a life of an algorithm far. There's a lot of possibilities, and I'm not all critical of algorithms. I love them. There are many possibilities. We can use them as black box algorithms to batch process and generate material, and use them as interactive AI we play with, like improviser, and possibly future they can become autonomous and create things by their own. And they help us to explore what is possible. They allow work on new abstractions where we can define goals and processes in terms of pattern systems, potentials, instead of exact like notes or note sequences or things like that. We can think in terms of styles, for example. And these abstraction levels leads to new crafts. When you work with these tools on that level, there are new problems that appear, and artists doing that repeatedly will actually learn a craft that is fundamentally different from those who grew up writing notes by pen and paper, for example. Of course, AI algorithms are interesting in themselves as a topic, but also as a medium for expression. So you know, actually, an artwork can be about its coming into being through AI and sort of be critical in itself. Related to the higher level of abstractions, they actually allow us to work with more complex material that we couldn't work with before. For example, processing long stretches of video material and things like that was on a high level, like colorizing or sharpening and these kind of things. So there are so many things we actually can do, but there is a discrepancy between the current discussion of agency in AI art, how we talk about it, how we perceive it. We say the machine did it, the computers can paint like Van Gogh. They cannot. They can do a style transfer, which is the common term. They can do some kind of mashup between one image and another. For example, the portrait of me that was in the call for this seminar was a Google Deep Dream production of a Bach score and my face. But if we look at the real situation, there are a lot of other things that actually contribute agency to these Van Gogh paintings. And this is a real problem, actually, because it's a problem of expectations in the general audience of politicians or whatever. So it also becomes a political problem. It's a problem of ethics, of authenticity, when we talk about things in a way that is not true. It's a PR problem for AI because first, it creates a lot of bullshit art, excuse my expression, where there are lots of other people trying to do sort of really new stuff with AI and try to make it creative for real. And it also wrongly attributes agency when there is none, actually. So I think this is a very important thing to address. So if we look at agency, defining the classical stronger meaning, which goes back to Aristotle and David Hume and many other old philosophers, it's sort of the capacity to influence or to cause effect, to start something, the capacity to act. But there's a lot in recent philosophy. There's a lot of theory around weaker meanings of agency, where it can also be ascribed to objects, even to a rock or water or something. And Bruno Latour's actor network theory is one example of a theory that incorporates this kind of weaker agency, anything that affects the outcome of an action. And he sort of asks, what change does it make, a certain actant, what change does it make to the result or to a process? And to sort of sort out this in a context of tools and tool makers and algorithms, etc., I introduce the term influence, which is of course not new, but I talk about influential agency, anything that has influenced the result. And let me see here. I lost my thread here. So basically, anything that sort of alters the results, we can have the thought experiment to see what kind of influence. Just like Latour asked, what difference does it make? We can say, okay, if I used a different tool to do a certain thing, what change what influence would that have? If I changed the person I collaborated with, what kind of influence would that person have, etc., or change any other constraint? And we can talk about sort of conditional and influential agency here. They can exist in parallel. And the influence brings meaning, references to the work. If we can detect this influence, it certainly brings references. It's sort of decoupled of intentions. For example, in the case of tool makers, where the tool makers create a tool that can do a lot of things, but they don't intentionally apply it. That's the tool user. But still the tool maker influences what can be done by providing potentials, for example. So there are so many different steps in a creative process, all down to different parameter choices and tweaks that brings influence to something. And we can look at it as, for example, tools bring agency by proxy. So before we had very simple tools like a hammer or something, or maybe a violin is still actually a simple tool in comparison. Now we have very, very complex tools that have sort of stylistic implications. They might come with databases, they come with lots of templates, they come with very complex consequences. So the sort of influence of tool makers and of the tools themselves really becomes an issue. And we can also go really way back. When I was working with evolutionary music, there's some of Darwin's influence on what I'm doing. If he didn't formulate his theory of evolution, or well, somebody else probably would have, and they were in parallel. But you know, there is an influence on my musical systems because I studied his theories, etc. And there is others influence from my counterpoint teacher and things that they said, and my parents, and blah blah. So it goes way back. It's really a complex thing. We can also think of influence as information, bringing in information into the process. So anything a decision is taken during the creative process, it sort of brings in some information, and a tool embeds certain information that is imprinted on the result. And even though we can't quantify this exactly, we can discuss sort of magnitude of it. Also, of course, if it's a long creative process, some of that information will be lost in the process. Some of it is redundant, transformed, erased, etc. But there certainly is a correlation between the information flowing in through a creative process, through decisions and actions, and the information and the amount of information contained in the finished work. And I will later relate this to effort also, because it's correlated in an interesting way. Excuse me, it's a bit dry air here. So we can look at the influential agency of humans, which appears or emerges through decisions and details, and of the tool maker, and as a designer of potentials. We can talk about influence from algorithms, influential agency of algorithms, where sort of emergence happens when you can't really trace the influence on the results to the low-level design. There might be non-deterministic processes that also cannot be backtracked, and there might be effects over time, over a long time, due to increased complexity, learning, etc. And also when an algorithm interacts with, or any creative process involves a large number of humans, over time it will be harder and harder to trace where this influential agency lies. So if we look at today's typical AI, or the well-known AI art projects, there are so many ways to do this, but just to choose something as an example. For example, the Van Gogh thing, or Van Gogh paintings, etc. There is some human who invented a general algorithm, in some cases inspired by nature, well, you know, artificial neurons or evolution or something like that. Some human or humans programmed a particular implementation as a library, or published as pseudocode or whatever. It's still very general, and they had no contact with you who actually will implement this artwork, but they still did something. They created a tool that you will use. Some humans chose which algorithm to use in this particular project. Some humans chose how the generated material is to be represented as a data structure. Should the music be a list, a tree, a grammar, some generative code, or should it emerge from a rule system, or should it be a waveform? There are myriads of parameters for executing these algorithms. We choose training sets, which also involve lots of critical choices, and we tweak parameters based on iterated outcomes and during the design process or testing. And we also cherry pick from a mass of generated outputs. And for example, I just did in the book chapter, I analyzed this particular example, a system I wrote about 20 years ago that composes complete piano pieces through evolutionary computation. And there were so many components that are invented by others that really influenced that I could do this and how I did this. Evolutionary computation in general, genetic programming. I did the overall design. The genetic representation was designed by me, but inspired by lots of literature where I could learn how to have tree structured genomes and how to do crossover and mutations in those, etc. The fitness criteria were influenced by a lot of things also, what I think is good music, and that is in turn influenced by my composition teachers and all the music I ever listened to, etc. So as you can see, when we build a system that produces piano pieces of a certain kind or pictures of that look like Van Gogh, to say that the computer does it or has made this or have painted this is sort of not really true. There's also a very interesting aspect of agency being where in the code, because a large part of the code might be AI, which is very good at classification or evaluation or whatever it does. But there's also a lot of normal code, loops and simple tests and action loops and if you do AI that plays a game, for example, and that's usually where the action happens. And in my system, Ossia, for example, it will just generate new pieces, and if you play on the piano that it performs the pieces on, it's made for a computer-controlled player piano, it will react to that and evolve a new piece based on what you did. But it will never change that loop. It will never get tired. It will not react to the house burning down or whatever. And a large part of the agency resides in this very traditional simple code, and that's also something to take into account. So one thing that I sort of want us to think in terms of is a kind of a spectrum of agency, which is a spectrum of sort of magnitude of influence, but it's also related to time and sort of remoteness in the creative process. So we have the tool designer maybe 100 years ago, who invented the piano I'm playing on. We have the tool maker who makes this specific tool that I'm using. The actual tool in itself that carries an embedded agency. We have the tool user, which is me, that produces an artwork that in itself has embedded influential agency from me and all these people, and even the receiver and the listener does some kind of a creative act in the interpretation of the work. And there are a lot of feedback paths here, of course, because any artwork becomes part of art history and influences tool makers, tool designers and tool makers and future tool users. We can also think in a spectrum of tool complexities with simple tools like a pencil or something, template-based tools that come with sort of databases of clip art or something like that. We have simple rule systems where there are sort of we can project into the unknown through formal processes, generative tools and algorithms where most of today's AI algorithms would end up, where they actually generate large masses of complex material, and maybe in the future autonomous tools that maybe are instead actually autonomous agents. And we can also think in terms of a spectrum of generativity, where the actual material, the medium that we work in, impose certain constraints, and constraints are both restrictive and generative. So it sort of generates pathways of what is possible to represent in this medium. The same with the tool. It sort of generates also a lot of possibilities at the same time as it's constrained the results for certain things that are not possible to make. Rule systems have slightly more complex such implications, generative algorithms, interactive AIs, and autonomous AIs in sort of a gradual increase of complexity. There's to understand what I mean with these things, we can think a little bit about effort versus tool complexity. Basically, if I as an artist use a very simple tool or a complex tool, and if I put in little or a large effort when doing the work. And there are some obvious cases. A simple tool with very little effort, it will be very trivial and not very interesting, just playing a simple melody on an instrument that I don't know. A simple tool with a large effort where I apply skills from training, that is basically part of the effort, and I spend a lot of time with it, then the main part of the influential agency will be from me as an artist, not so much from the tool maker, because the tool is maybe quite simple. But of course, also a lot of influential agency that influenced my preferences, etc. But that's slightly different. Very little will come from the tool, because it was a very simple tool. So still, I can write a symphony with a pen and paper, or I can do a very complex performance on a violin if I'm a violinist. I can't do that, but others can. And also, if I use a very complex tool, but with very little effort and interaction, that's another interesting case. So the tools contains maybe presets or generative algorithms, so it has a large amount of embedded information and influential agency in itself. But my influence will be very small because I don't spend too much effort. So basically, I take a huge piece of software and I make something fancy with the standard default choices and the most obvious choices on the menu. And since I rely on ready-made material, etc., the main part of the influential agency will be from the tool maker. And every artist who does that will end up also be sort of affected by the conformistic implications of this tool. Then there are some non-obvious cases, like if I use a very complex tool of my own design but use very little effort. So maybe I coded a very advanced generative algorithm and I just use it to keep producing masses of pop songs or something. So there's very little inflow of information, and the main influence comes from the tool maker, which is me, but I will exhaust the possibilities. So the influence from the tool is diluted over time as the output grows. So basically it won't be so interesting after all. It's interesting in the beginning, but if I use it to produce a lot of output, it will not be so interesting. If I use a complex tool by somebody else, but I use it with large effort, that's another interesting case. So during this effort in the creative process, there's a big inflow of information from me as an artist, selection, navigation in the solution space, etc. And that might lead to me finding very remote corners in the solution space. There's an initial large influence from the tool maker, but as I also contribute a lot during the process, and the tool maker's influence was sort of devoid of intention, more of potential, and then I as an artist contribute a lot of influence, and within that field of potential actually the final results will be very much me and less toolmaker, but still to quite some extent toolmaker. But it will be a lot of me, and another user using the same tool will end up somewhere else, so it will be them, and this artwork will be sort of me. You see what I mean? So it actually makes sense also with complex tools to put in the same kind of large effort that you do with simple tools. Just keeping track of time here. So so what about if we go to more generative algorithms and AI systems, etc., and look at what actually what kind of agency do they have? And there are a couple of colleagues of mine, Ollie Bown and John McCormack, both active in Australia. They published a paper on the idea of creative agency, with which they mean the creative contribution attributable to the actual system. The novelty and value that cannot be directly attributed to the computational system should have no weight in supporting claims about the creativity of that system. And they mean that this is what we really should look at when evaluating this system. And what are the criteria for this? And it's sort of hard. There are no definitive answers, but some questions that may help is, when do we take our hands off the system and what happens then? What remains of our design over time? Does the solution space change? Does it restart each time we run it? Will it change? The way it's explored change? Will there be some internal state, something that linger? Will it actually basically evolve over time? What are the aesthetic constraints of the representation? For example, in an evolutionary system, the representation, the selection criteria, genetic operators, are those also evolving? And maybe even, is the system implemented in, is the system it lives in also evolving? Is it an open-ended implementation like ourselves? The way we actually work is also evolving, not just our thoughts. So, and that was one of John McCormack's open problems that he published in 2010, that models need to be implemented in the same domain as the creative output. If you compare this to natural evolution, that's a rather difficult criterion to live up to. You can also think about, is there a sufficient inflow of information from interaction with other agents, etc. And from all this follows that process, and I already mentioned this a couple of times, is crucial. That systems develop over time. There is we need to allow time for things to develop, for complexity to grow, for learning. And when you do that, there's accumulation of interaction, and the influence becomes blurred and can sort of be claimed by the system because it's untraceable. Also, there needs to be room for mistakes, which has a crucial role in the production of novelty in creative process, and which is well known in creativity research. And also, there is a strong role of forgetting. Each human restarts, which systems don't do. Our accumulation is during a lifespan. It sort of fades. Some is retained in culture, but each human has to relearn. And we gradually forget and filter memories and reinterpret them, etc. And this is a condition for relearning, but in AI, this is not handled very well yet. And digital systems have a potential for perfect accumulation if we look a little bit further in the future, and that causes a problem of many kinds. So I see on the time here that there's still a lot to talk about, of course. I will just mention a few of the other things that are part of this chapter. This is a short recap of a previous publication where I analyzed in detail some main problems from a creativity perspective of these kinds of AI systems. One is the inherent non-creativity of statistical machine learning. Basically, they're designed to give the most probable answer, and that is that is something that really prevents them from helping us exploring things. They're really made for optimization. Opaqueness, of course, we get results, but it's very hard to know how and why those results appeared. There's a lot of research, of course, going on with that, but it's the same in nature. We can breed a new kind of species of dog, but we don't know which exact gene made it better at finding drugs or being very nice to their owner, etc. The black box nature of a lot of current AI is a problem because there's a lack of interaction in contrast to human creative process, which is an extended process. There's a lack of information flowing in and out, etc. There is a fundamental lack of a model of the outside world, which basically leads to a lack of semantic understanding in these algorithms, which means that we are basically emulating the surface, the statistical properties of the symptoms of what other people have, what people have created. They are not relating to what actually caused that. This is a huge, there's a lot here. I'm not going to go there for time reasons. I want to say a little bit about aesthetics related to this. Oops, sorry. There I am. I see there are some questions in the chat. I'll answer that afterwards. For example, we have a tendency to ascribe agency to a human, whatever we see. There we have these, one of them is a phenomena called pareidolia. I think the other one is called apophenia, where we see patterns and meaning when there is none. So a lot of abstract art we can interpret as we want. We see faces in nature. If I do a computer program that generates abstract patterns, the viewer will see their own meaning. They will read meaning into it, even if it's to a large extent random. or uncorrelated to the outside world. There's a large discussion about that we look at and reflect upon computer-generated music or images as if they are made by humans. It seems like we need a human to relate, and often some kind of artistic Turing test is suggested as an evaluation method, which is very problematic because usually there are even competitions that are based on this, where you just listen to music made by AI systems, which is ridiculous because the original Turing test, of course, is a test of interaction or responses, where you sort of probe another agent to see if it has consciousness, not looking at the portrait of it. So, you know, it simply doesn't make sense. So the truth, the quality in sort of any kind of system is in the variability, in the responsivity in the interaction, not in the quality of one particular output. There is a large discussion of what we perceive. If we know it's from a machine, we can actually like it more because there's a wow factor. There's something called the computational sublime, also a term from John McCormack actually. There's this wow factor. Well, here it's about the computational sublime. But also effort comes in. Is there an effort with an algorithm? We can perceive effort in terms of complexity, of density, of sort of perceptual streams, etc. But it doesn't really make sense in terms of machines. So this is also another huge, another huge topic. I will jump a little bit here to two important points. Authenticity of AI art is also something we should discuss because it's absolutely crucial in human art. But when we say this picture is painted by a computer, it looks like Van Gogh, it's actually not honest about where it comes from. We sort of hide the still embedded huge human influential agency. And it also in some way wants to be human art. So it's sort of inauthentic in several ways. And also AI art should in some interesting way, some meaningful way embrace mistakes and bugs and limitations. But you know, we are so far from these concepts. So this kind of mimetic AI art is fundamentally non-authentic from my point of view. And I will skip the sort of cross-species art when we have general AIs that create art for themselves, etc. I will not go there. I will just go to conclusions and basically, will AI make art making easier, which is an illusion many people seem to have. Can anyone or everyone do this? My answer is perhaps, but your agency correlates to the information you put in and the amount of interaction. So the answer is no, there's no free lunch. With little effort spent and little information flow, you will get fast results, but they will be very impersonal, and your agency will be insignificant. Yes, with open-ended interactive generative systems, anybody with aesthetic judgment can spend enough time to breed or grow or generate characteristic and personal material and get interesting results. It's not more efficient than making art before, but it's different, and your agency will be significant. So it is certainly possible. So I see from the time here that I will just show you a large number of conclusions and open up for questions. So thank you, if you're still there.
Thank you. I see that Ahmed is here, so maybe you should take the lead on the discussion. I will stop recording, maybe. That's the easiest. That's the plan, Selpi.
Yes, please stop recording.
I stop recording.